Jimmy Fallon frozen when George Clooney suddenly pushes back his chair after this revelation that night on The Tonight Show stage. George Clooney pushed back his chair. Not to stand. Not to leave. He pushed it back the way a man pushes back from a table when something has been placed in front of him that he needs more distance to look at clearly. His hands came off the armrests. His body went completely still. He was not performing stillness. He was inside it, the way a person goes inside something when the outside world has temporarily ceased to be the point. Jimmy Fallon had just finished a sentence. A single sentence. 11 words. He had read them from a card his producer had handed him 30 seconds earlier, and he had read them without knowing what they would do. And now, George Clooney had pushed back his chair and was sitting with both hands flat on his thighs, looking at a point somewhere above and beyond the desk between them, as if the air in that spot had become a surface he needed to examine. 300 people in that studio did not move. The segment producer, who had handed Jimmy the card, was standing in the stage-left corridor watching through the monitor, and said afterward that she had worked in television for 16 years and had passed that card to Jimmy the same way she passed every card, without thinking, and that she would spend a long time afterward thinking about what it means to hold something without knowing what it is. The Tonight Show control room still talks about what happened that night. It was a Thursday evening in November. The Tonight Show had George Clooney in the chair for the first time in 2 years, the kind of booking the producers circled on the calendar months in advance. The audience had lined up outside 30 Rock since early afternoon, couples who had driven in from Westchester and New Jersey, men in their late 50s who had come with their wives and were quietly more excited than they admitted, women who remembered the years when George Clooney was the thing you talked about on a Friday at work. And the conversation lasted until someone had to leave. The studio was full and loud in the way it gets when an audience has decided before the show begins that they are going to enjoy themselves. George Clooney had walked out and the room had responded the way rooms respond to him, not just with applause, but with a kind of collective ease, the specific relaxation of being in the presence of someone who has never once in public seemed to be trying too hard. The first 20 minutes were exactly that. Warm, quick, real. He was telling a story about his property in Italy, something that was going sideways in a funny direction, and the audience was leaning in, and Jimmy was laughing the way he laughs when something is genuinely landing rather than when he is performing the laugh. And then Jimmy's producer appeared at the edge of his eye line and passed him a card. Jimmy glanced at it. He looked up at George. He read it aloud. "Does the name Vincent Calabrese mean anything to you?" The entire studio froze. George Clooney did not answer immediately. He pushed back his chair. His story about Italy dissolved. His hands came off the armrests. He looked at Jimmy with the expression of a man who has just heard a name arrive in a room where he had not expected it, from a direction he had not been watching. Jimmy saw that expression and stopped being a host. He put the card down flat on the desk and leaned forward and said, very quietly, "George, take your time." George Clooney looked at the card on the desk. Then he looked at the audience. Then he looked back at Jimmy. His jaw was set. His eyes were doing something they are not usually seen doing in public, which is filling. He did not let them fill completely. He held it with the particular discipline of a man who has spent decades deciding what he will and will not show. He exhaled slowly. 300 people held their breath. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, caught perfectly by his microphone. "Vince Calabrese," he said. "Yeah, that name means something to me. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1974. George Clooney wasn't always George Clooney, the name and the ease that the whole world recognized. In the spring of 1974, In Augusta, Kentucky, a man named Vincent Calabrese was 41 years old and running the audiovisual department of Augusta Independent School District out of a converted storage room that the district had given him because no other room was available. He had come to Augusta from Cincinnati 6 years earlier. With a broadcast journalism degree, he had not managed to turn into a broadcasting career and a conviction, arrived at quietly and without bitterness, that what he was actually good at was not being on camera, but being the person who understood what happened between the camera and the audience. He was not a celebrated teacher. The district employed him as a technician, someone to manage the film projectors and the reel-to-reel equipment and the single-color television that was shared between the gymnasium and the library on a rolling cart. But he had converted his storage room over 6 years, with salvaged equipment and district surplus and 3 cameras he had bought at an estate sale and repaired himself, into something that functioned, barely, as a television studio. He ran an after-school program that he called the Augusta Broadcasting Club, which had no official standing with the district administration and no budget, and which he funded himself, at a cost he never discussed, because he believed that the children in that town deserved to understand how the thing they watched every evening actually worked. In September of 1974, a 10-year-old boy named George came to the club. His father, Nick Clooney, was a television personality in the region, a broadcaster with a local following, and a visible presence, and a profession that his son had grown up watching, with the particular mixture of pride and longing that children feel when a parent's work makes them simultaneously larger than life and less available. George had his father's instinct for a room, but none yet of his father's confidence that the instinct was worth trusting. He was funny and quick and deflected anything serious with a joke, which Vincent Calabrese recognized immediately as the signature of a child who had learned to manage attention rather than receive it. He did not say this to George. He said it to himself, in his records, in the journal he kept about the program. He noted that the boy moved differently in front of a camera than away from it, not better, not more performed, but more located, as if the camera gave him a set of coordinates he did not otherwise have. He wrote, "He is looking for a frame that fits him. He hasn't found it yet. Let him keep looking." For 2 years, Vincent let George Clooney run equipment, then operate a camera, then sit in the anchor chair they had built from a borrowed stool and a piece of fabric stapled to a plywood backing, and a clip-on light that overheated if left on for more than 8 minutes. He let him fail at seriousness and succeed at comedy, and then, slowly, find the register where seriousness and comedy were not opposites but the same tool, held at different angles. He ran the Augusta Broadcasting Club every Tuesday and Thursday after school until 6 o'clock, and sometimes later if something was in the middle of being figured out. And he locked up alone and drove home in a car that needed work he kept deferring because the money had gone somewhere else. In the spring of 1976, George Clooney was in the anchor chair for the club's end-of-year broadcast, a production that was seen by approximately 40 people, most of them parents, on a monitor set up in the school gymnasium. He delivered a 2-minute piece he had written himself about a local issue he had reported on by making phone calls from the school's front office phone with Vincent's permission. It was not polished. It was not confident in a way that could be called assured. But it was entirely, unmistakably real. Vincent watched it from behind the camera and wrote one line in his journal that evening. There it is. George Clooney's family moved from Augusta to Kentucky, and then further by the time he was 16, following his father's career through its various stations. The club dissolved the year after George left. The district finally reclaimed the storage room for actual storage. Vincent Calabrese went back to working as a technician. He never ran a program like that again, not because he stopped believing in it, but because the conditions that had made it possible, the room, the surplus equipment, the years of accumulated repair work, did not reassemble themselves. He moved back to Cincinnati in 1983, worked in local broadcast production for a decade, retired in 1998. He was 89 years old now. He had been in a care facility in Cincinnati for 3 years. His son, a man named David Calabrese, had written to a Tonight Show producer in the spring. He had found his father's journals in a filing cabinet in the garage when the family home was sold. 11 notebooks. 31 years of records. The Augusta Broadcasting Club had 5 pages of entries. George Clooney's name appeared 14 times. The last entry, dated May 28, 1976, read, "The camera didn't make him. He made the camera. I was just there to keep the lights on." David had included a photograph with the letter, a Polaroid, slightly faded, of a 10-year-old boy sitting in an anchor chair made of a stool and plywood and a clip-on light, squinting slightly from the overheating bulb, holding a piece of paper that was meant to be a script, looking directly into the camera with an expression that anyone who has watched George Clooney for 30 years would recognize immediately as the expression he still uses when he is about to say something he means. Tonight Show staff had been told only that new information had come to light connected to the evening's guest. They had not been told its nature or its source. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Behind the scenes, George Clooney had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He had not been told the content of the card before the taping. He had agreed, through his team, that the Tonight Show could introduce a documentary element into the interview, new research, a historical connection, without being told the specifics. It was an unusual arrangement, and his team had pushed back on it twice, and he had overruled them both times, because something in the description had made him want to be in the room without preparation. He wanted to be found by it, rather than ready for it. The Tonight Show producer had honored that completely. The card had been written, sealed, and held until the natural pause she had identified in the interview. Jimmy Fallon had not read it before he read it aloud. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. A man in his late 80s had been brought to the studio that evening in a wheelchair, accompanied by his son David and a care facility nurse who had made the trip because Vincent Calabrese had told the facility director that he was going to Cincinnati to have dinner with his son, which was not true. And the director had sent the nurse along to be safe, and the nurse had said afterward that she had never been so glad to have been lied to in her life. Vincent Calabrese was in the stage-left corridor, outside the curtain in his wheelchair, waiting. He had been waiting there since the taping began. He was wearing a jacket and a tie, which his son said he had asked to wear specifically, and which he had not worn in 2 years. George Clooney stood up from the pushed-back chair and walked to the edge of the stage and looked into the stage-left corridor and saw a man in a wheelchair in a jacket and a tie, and he stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides and his jaw working, and then he stepped down off the stage without using the stairs and walked to the wheelchair and crouched in front of it and put both hands on the armrests and looked at Vincent Calabrese from a distance of about 14 inches. Vincent looked back at him. He was thin. His hands, folded in his lap, were the hands of a man of 89. But his eyes held the same quality of attention they had held when George Clooney was 10 years old in a plywood anchor chair, patient, specific, entirely present. The look of a man who has always been more interested in what he is watching than in being seen watching it. "Mr. Calabrese," George said. His voice was not the voice he uses in films. It was the voice underneath that voice. "You found me." "Your son found me," George said. "My son did good," Vincent said. George laughed, short, involuntary, the real one, and pressed his hand over his eyes for a moment. Then he took one of Vincent's hands in both of his. "I've thought about that room 100 times," George said. "The camera that overheated. The stool." "The light," Vincent said. "The light that overheated," George corrected, and they both knew what that meant, and neither of them needed to explain it. David, standing to the side, produced a padded envelope from his jacket. He handed it to George. Inside was the Polaroid, the 10-year-old boy in the anchor chair, squinting from the light, holding the script, looking directly into the camera. George held it with both hands and looked at it for a long time. "I have kept this photograph for 49 years, Vincent said. "My wife used to ask me why I kept a photograph of a child she'd never met." He paused. "I told her, because this one was going to make it, and I wanted proof I was there." George Clooney did not respond for a moment. When he did, his voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when what is behind them is not steady at all. "You were more than there," he said. "You were the reason there was a there to be in." Jimmy Fallon had come down from the desk. He was standing 2 steps behind George, not speaking, his hand pressed flat against his sternum. He did not try to return to the interview. Questlove had stood up from the drum kit. The cameraman closest to the corridor did not pull back. The director did not cut to commercial. The standing ovation moved from the front rows backward and outward through the studio like a wave, slow and full, the way a wave moves when the water behind it is very deep. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Vincent Calabrese returned to Cincinnati that night with his son and the nurse who was glad to have been lied to. He passed away 11 weeks later on a Sunday morning in February at the care facility with David beside him. He was 89 years old. He had asked David, in the days after the taping, to donate the journals to the Augusta Independent School District, which David did, delivering them in person on a Tuesday in January. And the district's current superintendent said she did not know the Augusta Broadcasting Club had existed and spent 3 hours reading the notebooks before she could put them down. The Polaroid, the original, the one George Clooney had held at the edge of the Tonight Show stage, was framed and now hangs in the converted storage room that is still, 5 decades later, the Augusta Independent School District's audio-visual department, above the current equipment rack, below a small card that reads, "The camera didn't make him. He made the camera." George Clooney attended the small service in Cincinnati on a Tuesday, quietly, without announcement, and sat in the 3rd row, and did not speak publicly, and did not need to. Jimmy Fallon mentioned the evening once, near the end of that television season, when a reporter asked him what moment from the year he would keep. He said, "A man in a jacket and tie in a wheelchair, in a corridor, waiting," he said. "I have been doing this job for a long time, and I did not know a room could do what that room did." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Some lights overheat and some burn for 50 years, and the only difference is who thought to keep them on.